China is one of the most important countries in the world, the second largest economy, second highest population, and one of the largest manufacturing hubs on the planet. It also has the second highest number of billionaires, if you're wondering how communist it is. However, it was not always this way. China spent the early 20th century in a state of societal collapse after the revolution against the Qing Dynasty led to a weak republic that was supplanted by warlords and dictatorial nationalist rule, which was then overturned by the Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong. However, this was not inevitable. Communist rule was only cemented after a years-long civil war that was broken up by World War II and the Japanese invasion. Which of course begs the question, what if the Nationalists won the Civil War? Or at least, what if they won most of it? Because while the most plausible way to do this is to have Chiang Kai-shek defeat the Communists during the Long March or some other event prior to the Japanese invasion, I think it would be more interesting to have the Communists survive in the Northeast. Sort of a reversal of our timeline with Taiwan being home to the Nationalist government in exile, even though most of them no longer want reunification. However, this is harder than the Long March gamble, failing for a few reasons. Chiefly, Mao had the support of the people. Chiang had lost most of his public support over the duration of the war due to incompetence and corruption, the latter of which had materially weakened the Kuomintang army in Mao's favor. In addition, the Nationalists had taken the brunt of the Japanese invasion since they were the bigger force at the time. Finally, when the Soviets gave Manchuria to Mao, the Communists gained access to the Japanese stockpile left over from their occupation of the country. However, we can still make this work. See, in the aftermath of the Sino-Japanese War, both the US and Soviets wanted to avoid civil war in China and attempted to push for a coalition government. However, the Soviet withdrawal from Manchuria was one of the reasons that this broke down. Mao would later reject Stalin's attempt to reopen negotiations and push for total reunification. Incidentally, I think this was the first time Stalin ever attempted to save lives. However, that was in our timeline, wherein the CCP had seen massive successes throughout all of 1947 and gradually amassed numerical and material superiority over the exhausted Nationalists. Thus, what we'll do is have the Nationalists win the third stage of the Summer Offensive as well as the alternate versions of the Autumn and Winter Offensives of 1947. While this is a stretch, hopefully we can concoct some situation in which the Nationalists are able to field more equal numbers in the Ping-Jin Offensive in Hebei. This way, with some luck, the Nationalists are able to keep the Communists on their side of the Yellow River. From there, while it's again a stretch, by 1948, Mao might be forced to negotiate if the battles are inconclusive enough. Of course, then we have the entire question of whether or not Chiang would want to do so, probably not, but frankly, it's not like he's advancing into Manchuria either. So, there's a ceasefire in August 1948 while the two factions rebuild. Officially, they celebrate the creation of a united China under their coalition government. However, in practice, this is an armistice and the creation of two Chinese states, since neither party would have much political influence on the other side. The Republic of China in the south centered on Nanjing, and the People's Republic of China in the north likely still centered on Beijing, since it's so far north it's still fair for the CCP to get it. Neither China is happy about this, obviously. However, Chiang likely survives the looming political crisis. The motherfucker held on to power until the 1980s after losing the entire mainland and his Security Council seat. Clearly, he was at least a decent politician to pull that off. Mao, however, is going to have a very bad day. The Soviets didn't actually like him too much, which eventually contributed to the Sino-Soviet split, and that was in our timeline where Mao led the most populated and arguably third most powerful country on the planet. Here, he's a failure who refused Stalin's attempt to stabilize the Civil War situation. As a result, I fully expect Mao to disappear. North China is more or less brought into the Soviet sphere of influence, and Stalinist orthodoxy remains much stronger in the socialist world. However, it should be noted that Manchuria was also the most industrialized part of China at this point in time, and was at least a little less beat up than the rest of the country, since the Soviet invasion of the region was over in less than a month. As a result, despite Mao being thrown to the wayside, I would argue that the People's Republic of China would be in a better position at the start. And considering Mao was hardly the most competent man in China, they'd probably keep that going for a while. However, Manchuria would very much be a Soviet puppet. Stalin put his man in Beijing, and he will keep his man in that city. As an aside, I'm going to use PRC, North China, and Manchuria more or less interchangeably, but the official name would be People's Republic of China. So that's North China, but what about the Kuomintang government in the south? Well, it'll be rough. While the Japanese invasion had forced China to come together in order to resist being conquered, it seems that Chiang's rule would still be fragmentary, or at least not as stable as he would like it to be. In addition, Chiang would likely maintain control over the country for quite some time as it was rebuilt. Despite modernizing the country and the democratic constitution finally being enacted in 1947, Chiang had been in control of China in some form or another since the 1920s. While his control over the mainland would limit his excuse to shut down elections, they were emergency provisions due to the Civil War and communist takeover, it seems fair to me to say that he would likely heavily control the party and government. In addition, Chiang's China is the poorer part of the country. Like I said, Manchuria was the more industrialized region and ironically has better access to the Soviet world. See, Chiang's ideology was incredibly nationalist, no fucking duh, and he believed that both the Soviets and the US were out to exploit China, and he would likely be skeptical of taking too much American money if he could help it. That being said, he was also ideologically consistent. When he was offered French Indochina because FDR really hated de Gaulle, he reacted very harshly and supported Korean independence from Japan. Regardless, Kuomintang China would not be an open economy for the United States to invest in, and that would limit their economic growth. Do they grow? Oh, absolutely. You can't be a country like China and not. It would just be slower than in our timeline due to starting from a lower floor and the economic isolation. Again, Mao had Soviet help until he broke with Khrushchev. However, without the Great Leap Forward, such growth would also be more organic and sustainable, which means that China certainly won't be a poor country in the long run. Let's zoom out to the world writ large for a second. Frankly, both the US and Soviets benefit from this partition. The Soviets have a much tighter leash on China, by which I mean they have one. In addition, the Korean War is pretty unlikely to happen. While it was Kim's idea, he still needed some approval from Stalin and Mao. Without Mao as a decision figure and without a wholly communist China, I see little reason for Stalin to acquiesce to the move in 1950, though there is the possibility that Khrushchev or another more expansionist leader supports the move later on anyway. However, the US obviously benefits more than the Soviets. The Kuomintang Chinese likely get the UN Security Council seat since they control most of the country, are larger, and aren't humiliated by losing the mainland, and that means one more Security Council seat hostile to Moscow. Also, this obviously has massive implications for the Vietnam War, but we'll get there. The Chinese partition and no Korean War limits the scale of the Cold War. It's still a big deal, sure, and the US and USSR are still going to undermine each other as much as possible, but it's not seen as extremely. Domino theory is less likely to become the mainstream among the American political class, for example, and the idea of the Red Scare creeping into economics might not be so intense. Hell, maybe we get free healthcare out of Truman this time, since he still has until 1952. As a result, the US political spectrum is like 2 notches further to the left. It's still by far the more conservative power compared to the Soviets, and counterculture will still pop up to reflect that, but it won't be as extreme as in our world. Sticking with America, the Republicans are going to win 1952. The Democrats had been in power for 20 years at this point. Even with a more united party, I would consider them doomed. And I haven't given them a more united party. With this more limited Cold War, there's also a possibility that the US agrees with Stalin about a united, neutral Germany. This would be a massive stretch, since the US probably doesn't want to give up on that industrial base, and likely doesn't believe the Soviets for a second about respecting German neutrality if the Cold War does go conventionally hot. However, there are some strategic advantages. The ideological border is moved from Germany down to Italy and Yugoslavia, and since they're still unlikely to march to Stalin's orders, the European barrier is more or less only Greece and Turkey, which will also help mitigate tensions, assuming the Soviets don't get especially aggressive with Greece. On this map, I'm having France annex the Saarland for a few reasons. 1, I am a proponent of small Germany, and 2, Western Europe was extremely skeptical of uniting Germany in our timelines, to the point where Francois Mauriac, a French novelist, said that I like Germany so much I prefer to see 2 of them. And frankly, these feelings would probably be stronger closer to the war. For, I hope, obvious reasons. Now let's pivot back to the Chinas. What did their 1950s look like? Well, by 1956 or so, the PRC is going to be one of the best places to live in the Warsaw Pact. Due to industry, population, and the geographic position, it will be hard for the Soviets to keep it fully puppetized, especially without Stalin. As a result, while the communist theory they utilize is more akin to the Soviet model than our timeline, it will still be able to follow its own agenda, at least compared to Hungary or Poland. In fact, it's probably the second most important member of the alliance since East Germany was given up. I'm not sure if the leadership would be replaced after Khrushchev comes to power, but frankly, if it is, it would still mostly be a Chinese move, not a Soviet one. All this being said, their economy and military would still very much lean into supporting the Soviets on the world stage. They just have a lot more internal freedom than the rest of the Soviet bloc. During the 1950s, the PRC would, like the rest of the Warsaw Pact, likely see increased demands for autonomy or rights within the Soviet system. They're very much far away from the core of Soviet power and the bulk of the army, so the instability could last a while, possibly multiple months. However, Moscow will almost certainly step in when it has the means to. The problem is, this invasion will be an invasion, bordering on a full-scale war, though definitely one that the Soviets win, likely becoming quite a setback for Manchurian industry and autonomy. And you can forget about them starting a third phase of the Chinese Civil War or having their own nuclear weapons. In contrast, the Kuomintang would have such an arsenal, though it would be incredibly strenuous to maintain. However, considering the modernization efforts of Qing aren't likely to result in the largest man-made famine in the world, his China is likely beginning to pull ahead in terms of industry. However, his rule would be increasingly unpopular, and it would very much be his rule. It's very likely that he manages to get around term limits on the basis of North China existing, which would allow him more control over the country. But how exactly is he running the game? Well, while there have been amendments to the Constitution since 1947, Taiwan does still use the same general system. The 5 branches of government, or Yuan, were/are the Legislative Yuan, aka the National Assembly, who then elected the Executive Yuan, the Presidency, who appointed the head of the Legislative Yuan. In addition, the judiciary yuan was the Supreme Court, and the examination and control yuans existed. If I'm understanding correctly, the examination yuan controls the bureaucratic administrative side, while the control yuan handles things like budgetary audits and holds the other branches accountable with impeachment. Now, to clarify, there probably wasn't meant to be a circular logic of appointment between the president and the premier, since the president was originally a ceremonial position like the King of the United Kingdom or President of Ireland. But, and because of Qing's terms, the country evolved into a semi-presidential republic. Qing actually wanted to be premier, but the legislative yuan really wanted him to be president, and during that time he wound up expanding the powers of the presidency, and I see little reason that would change. In terms of foreign relations, the Kuomintang is more or less a third pillar in the Cold War, leading the world's non-aligned movement, or at least the faction centered in East Asia. While it wouldn't be the third largest economy, even the United PRC was only number 6 in 1960, it would be relevant by sheer numbers and the diplomatic weight of a non-aligned permanent seat on the UNSC. Though I suppose that begs the question of how non-aligned it would be in practice. Regardless, countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Burma, etc. would all be more or less affiliated with the Kuomintang government, giving China a reasonable sphere of influence. It would likely compete with India and potentially even see a repeat of the war, which could bring both sides into proper alignment in the Cold War, but I'm not 100% sure. However, if you promise democracy and instead rig elections or use the border as a justification to erode the constitution that you yourself set up, you're gonna have a bad time, especially in a country that is slowly but surely modernizing itself as opposed to being a complete train wreck desperate for an adult in the seat. British India saw increased demands for democracy as time went on. The Republic of Korea had a number of revolutions attempt this, and of course the 1950s were a hotbed of attempts by the Warsaw Pact nations to achieve the same goal. Thus, I think that sometime around the 1950s, Qing will see his first major challenges from the youth of the nation's burgeoning universities and the workers of its blooming industries. This movement wouldn't be a revolution in full, but realistically, I don't see how Qing could hold the autocracy through sham elections and parliamentary manipulation after so long. His government would have no credibility anymore. As a result, he likely would have been forced to step aside and repeal the emergency provisions of the Constitution, whatever they look like in this world. However, he would still be heavily influential in the Kuomintang as a political party, and they would define the conservative politics of the country. Now, before we get into the details, I do want to say that I know this is a massive stretch. Qing ruled Taiwan until his death in the 1980s, after all. However, the reason I'm having these protests arise in the 1960s is so that A, something actually happens, and B, I'll admit, I like democracy, sue me. I do also think that holding all of China hostage under a dictatorship would be harder for the nationalists than the communists. They wouldn't have the zealous support of Mao because the older generation remembers their failures during the invasion and civil war, and the younger generation want that democracy they've been promised. Oh, and for good measure, they have millions more people at this point, which likely contributes to political instability. Now, what are the politics behind these movements? Well, considering that the Kuomintang makes up the center of the political spectrum we're working with, we should probably start there. Qiangism, i.e. Qing's primary ideology, is hard to categorize. It's a right-wing nationalist movement defined by opposition to socialism and capitalism, similar to other attempts to create a third way, but it lacks the militaristic fantasies and was more accommodating to worker unions and welfare than such a state usually is. After the flight to Taiwan, the state also became very active in the market economy, which I think would carry over here. In addition, despite being a conservative and opposed to Western influence, he was also very interested in Christianity, universal education, and even feminism. He outlawed foot binding, thank fuck, and there was even a women's quota on the National Assembly, which I'm pretty sure is still unheard of everywhere else. So if that's our centrist faction, what would a counterculture and oppositional political philosophy look like? Well, it's unlikely to be socialistic in nature. The partition of China means that most active leftists in that category would be highly restricted in political activities. In addition, the bitter, angry youngsters calling for reform would see socialism as tied to the same broken status quo that's divided their country. So they'd likely be calling for the end of the right-wing command economy, a loosening of the market as a whole, but simultaneously reject a lot of Qing's more Western cultural values like feminism and Christianity. Oh god damn it, did I just invent conservative liberalism? And make it counterculture? Regardless, what do these reforms actually mean? Well, first and foremost, this isn't going to be a complete restructuring of the government or economy. The reformists, who I'll call the Republicans for the sake of a name, will probably just want more legitimate elections in the parliament and their economic reforms. Such moves would mostly entail freer trade, especially with the West, infrastructure modernization, and more culturally conservative politics regarding things like women's rights or religion. The biggest thing is that they would either want to restrict the powers of the presidency or force through direct elections. The Republic of China would also likely see the rise of a more social democratic lefty group, but during the Cold War it would be heavily limited due to institutional anti-communism and culturally by the PRC's existence, making socialism look bad. Sorry for the very quick interruption, but if you're enjoying the video so far, please consider a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel continue growing. And if you're already subscribed and want to support the show in other ways, I have channel memberships available for as little as $2.99 a month. Thank you, and let's get back to the show. Getting back to the rest of the world, the Kuomintang controlling mainland China won't stop the Vietnam from taking over northern Vietnam, and likely won't stop them from trying to reunify the country. Frankly, even with the Cold War remaining more muted in this timeline, there would still have to be some proxy wars. The main reason that Korea didn't happen on time was Stalin's own actions to prevent the conflict. I swear, I don't mean to defend Stalin there, he was just less eager to provoke direct confrontation with the West than, like, half of his allies. Regardless, the Vietnam War still starts in 1955, and Ho gets his ass handed to him. The US has all the liberty it wants to invade North Vietnam, something it did not have in our timeline. As a result, the US likely pushes very deep into the country, possibly even reunifying it under Saigon before 1960. Now, obviously, this has a lot of consequences. For example, Laos and Cambodia do not become communist either, thank God, because Cambodia scares me. In addition, there's millions of lives saved in the region. However, South Vietnam wasn't exactly well ran, so I would still expect the country to wind up an autocratic regime. Now, in our world, shortly after the Vietnam War ended in a unified socialist Vietnam, they would fight a border war with China, and while that probably wouldn't happen because Saigon just renewed their Uncle Sam insurance policy, there would still be that sort of tension. What do I mean by that? Well, let's just say that you're South China here. You recently opened up your political spectrum, which the US applauded. Now, neither of your two parties are actually that fond of the US. The Kuomintang's nationalism and anti-colonialism are skeptical of their intentions, and your new liberals think that their Western values are fundamentally alien, while their control of Japan and South Korea are seen as potential staging grounds for conflict with you. And that's not just you being paranoid, America has openly stated that Korea and Japan are vital to their military plans in the Pacific. And suddenly they take over Vietnam, but that's still another US vassal on your border. Hell, you have a land border with this one. Bear in mind, the Kuomintang rule over China has seen trade restrictions on the US and Soviets since the end of the war, meaning you don't actually need the Americans to continue your economic growth. So, South China is suddenly very tense with the US, denouncing their rapid expansion in East Asia as a threat to the region's stability. The US breaks off relations, and neither side are happy. And suddenly the ROC gets a call from the Soviets offering some nice trade deals and aid. Does China take it? Is this a reversal of the Sino-Soviet split? The American-Chinese split? Well, no, to both. No matter who is in charge of the Republic, they aren't allying with the Soviet Union. Mao arguably had to align with the US because of his diplomatic standing. He had none, and his land border with the Soviets making war riskier. In addition, Taiwan was politically important, but only became strategically essential later. The Republic does not have that luxury with Manchuria, which had been the industrial core of China, pushed the area between the Han population and invaders hundreds of miles north, and had plenty of resources. Oh, and for good measure, they occupy fucking Beijing. Realistically, these tensions aren't going to lead to war. The Republic knows how that goes, since it wouldn't even have the naval power to threaten South Korea. However, what cooperation existed between Washington and Nanjing would likely break down throughout the 1960s, and China spends the 1960s and 70s more or less diplomatically isolated. Its economic growth continues, and the country likely becomes more affluent by the 1980s, and would likely even begin a diplomatic outreach similar to what our timeline's China did. It likely butts heads with the Soviets first. Who knows, maybe the Republic is the one who funds anti-communist actions in Central Asia during the 70s and 80s. However, when the Soviets collapse, likely right on schedule, Manchuria is suddenly in a very awkward place, which has problems for the Republic of China. See, the early 1990s were the point in real life where most of Taiwan's population no longer wanted to join China, but that was after their own democratization and a much steeper physical divide. Here, China is a much freer society and geographically connected. It's entirely plausible that Manchuria goes either way. But on the other hand, there were certainly those in favor of United Ireland, and the same was true in Germany. In addition, while the actual leadership would change, Manchuria is likely big and industrialized enough to actually survive as a country. The Manchurian question would likely be the big question politically for both states for several years, and may not get resolved fairly and equitably, leaving Asia still scarred by the Cold War. Manchuria itself likely goes through a period of democratization, which removes that particular barrier to reunification, but I'm not really sure what that looks like beyond the nationalist question. However, with that, I think I need to end the scenario here. Despite their division since the end of the Civil War, the Republic of China stands tall as a free country and leading voice in Asia. The Cold War remains much more muted, with Germany being released as a buffer state between the US and Soviets, while the Korean War never happened, leaving only a swift American victory in Vietnam. However, the US and China do not get along here, and after the Vietnam War, their cooperation was seriously strained. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, Manchuria has cast off the communist puppets and begins its own path toward democracy and freedom. However, from there, the world becomes increasingly uncertain, and even reunification is unclear. Before we go, I want to give a thank you to channel members Marcellus Doretta, Tim Fredibold, Dubs Main, and Lissenberg Patriot, as well as an extra thank you to Dubs Main and Lissenberg Patriot for joining at the exclamation point level. Thank you so much for watching, please have a great day, and tune in next time to explore another alternate world.